Well, welcome everyone, and a special welcome to our video audience. It's good to have you with us. My name is Sherwin. I'm the pastor here, and if you want to know more about Laketon Bethel or support us financially, just go to our website, laketonbethel.org, and you'll be able to find out what you need there. Since the last time I was here, Diane and I took a little trip to Niagara Falls. That was kind of interesting, gave me a lot of windshield time to think. And we discovered the Canadian side is not near as much fun as the American side. So, sorry, Pam, I know that just breaks your heart, but how many stores can you go into that sell Canada shot glasses? You know, and hamburgers were $31 in this one place for a hamburger. I could buy a whole cow for that. You know, so, and plus my phone didn't work in Canada. So we crossed over into the US side of it, and, you know, instead of all the shops, there's a New York State Park there. And it was fun there and not as crowded. And so, sorry, Pam, we like the New York side better, but we still like you. So, today, I asked the question, very simply, can liberals be saved? And yesterday already, I got a bunch of feedback on it. I hadn't even delivered it yet. But some people were quite upset with me for having that on the marquee out there. But what brought this on, a few weeks ago, I was talking to an elder from another church here in Muskegon, one that has not left the Reformed Church. And he said to me that 2 or 3 families that he knows of left his church because one of the elders was a Democrat. I couldn't believe it. I'd heard of this before, but I didn't think it would happen in Muskegon County. I mean, we're all smarter than that. But it did, and I trust this guy. So, you know, we were talking about the different divisions. I kept thinking, what have we become? And I was actually left speechless for a few seconds there. It seems the message of Jesus has not permeated our culture, and that's something we need to look at. So today I want to highlight this idea of, well, can liberals be saved? But mostly I want to talk about this fact, that labels are lies all the time. When you call somebody a liberal, you are lying, because there's so many different kinds of folks who have so many different views on so many different positions. Liberals always lie. I get accused of being a liberal, and then people get confused. Because how can I be a liberal? Because I like guns, and I like to hunt. And how can I be a liberal? Because I don't like to spend money. And I grumble every time I have to pay taxes. But you know, if you call somebody a conservative, that's also a lie. I know people who call themselves conservatives, who've got a ton of debt, love to spend money. I know people who call themselves conservatives and big supporters of family values, but they're living with somebody they're not married to. But that's an exception then, you see. I know people who call themselves conservatives and we have to support American industry, and they drive Japanese cars. You see, so there's all kinds of oddities in there. Anytime we use labels, we are essentially dishonest. It doesn't make sense to use labels, but we do it anyway. I mean, I've heard that all liberals are atheists. Well, that's not true. I've heard that all conservatives are believers. That's definitely not true. But it's not helpful to label. So let's go back to the original question. Can liberals be saved? And what I want to do with this is look at a passage that's central to salvation, to see who can be saved and how does that apply. This is from Romans chapter 10, Paul's letter to the Roman Christians. About half of them had a Jewish background and half of them had a Greek background. They were very, very different from each other. So he was trying to get these two groups to get along with each other and accept each other. It's kind of an interesting thing. This is what he says in chapter 10. If you openly declare that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Now, it's fairly straightforward. He doesn't mention a political party there. He doesn't mention a denomination. He says if you openly declare that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. If you declare that Jesus is Lord, you're saying that you acknowledge the fact that he runs the universe. You acknowledge the fact that he is your Lord. And that means that you are willing to follow his teachings, that you trust him to save you, if you can say it and mean it. And if you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you know, I like that word believe in there. It's one of my favorite Greek words. It's the word pisteuo. And it means you could say believe or trust. Those are interchangeable definitions for that word. So that means that if you trust that God raised Jesus from the dead, you're in. It's just a key teaching. Believe this and you'll believe the rest of the gospel too. Paul goes on with this. He says, for it is by believing in your heart that you're made right with God, and it's by openly declaring your faith that you are saved. See, believing in your heart is trusting. Trust him to save you rather than trust yourself to save you. You can't do anything to get yourself saved. You have to trust him to do it. Trust him to save you rather than trying to be good enough. See, to be made right with God is God's action, not yours. We trust, he does the work. And it goes on. Paul quotes some Old Testament passages here, and he says, as the scriptures tell us, anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. Jew and Gentile are the same in this respect. They have the same Lord who gives generously to all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Again, he's making the point. Everyone is equal at the foot of the cross. Now, the New Living Translation, first part of verse 12 there says Jew and Gentile. I think it could be better translated as Hebrew and Greek, because he was drawing the contrast between the Jewish people and the non-Jewish people. So Hebrew and Greek, it would be a literal translation there, but they're the same in this respect. He says everyone is equal at the foot of the cross, even though there's a vast difference between Hebrew and Greek. These folks had major lifestyle differences. You know, the Jews had the Old Testament they adhered to strictly, and the Gentiles, or the Greeks, did whatever they felt like pretty much. And so it was a completely different culture in many different ways. But one thing they had in common is that both the Hebrew people and the Greek people, the wealthy ones, the upper 5 to 3%, owned slaves. Now, the Greeks were not under Old Testament law, so they could be less humane to their slaves without consequences. The Greeks did a lot of things that were morally reprehensible to the Jews, repulsive to the Jews. The Greeks bought slaves and used them as catamites, and they practiced pederasty, and it was considered normal. Things that we would be arrested for today, they considered normal behavior. The Greeks neutered their slaves so that there wouldn't be questions of paternity. And it was thought that would make them more docile, less rebellious. So they routinely neutered their slaves just as we would neuter our pets today. It was a brutal practice. To the Jewish person, that was abhorrent. They're even forbidden to neuter animals. They didn't do that sort of thing. But the Greeks did. So the Jews then, who became Christians, who became followers of Jesus, didn't always think that these pagan Greeks could be saved. But Paul is very firm on this. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. It's right there in black and white. So what this means to us is if we believe this gospel and trust Jesus to save us, we are saved. Not because of what we did, but because of what Jesus did. And everyone is the same. Everyone is equal at the foot of the cross. So let's go back to the original question. Can liberals be saved? Yes, they can. Can conservatives be saved? Okay. But it's best if we don't label them as such. When you label, you lie. And labeling is foolish behavior, and that foolish behavior is the Hebrew definition of sin. Serious sin. We need to accept those who disagree with us. And I have to tell you, that's been quite a challenge. I was thinking about that as I was talking with this elder from this other church who said 2 or 3 families were leaving because they had a Democrat on the consistory. I thought to myself as I was driving away from that meeting, what if they came here? What if they came to my office and said, we want to join Laketon Bethel? Are there any Democrats on the consistory? I'd have to say, I forgot to check. I honestly don't know what political party they support, and I don't care. But would I be able to accept them? Well, that's a challenge. Now, the early Christians had a word for things that did not pertain to salvation. And certainly your political affiliation or your views on some of these social issues don't pertain to salvation. That word that the early Christians had was a word called adiaphora. And they took it from Greek philosophy, where it basically meant things that are irrelevant. But adiaphora in the Christian doctrine sense, it's things that don't make a difference when it comes to salvation. And we have lots of those, and they're feisty. I'm going to list a few of them, and they'll probably make some of you uncomfortable. But, when I was a intern in Muskegon at First Reformed, which is now Applewood Ministries on the corner of Apple and Wood, and I remember being there, standing in the entryway one Sunday morning. Maybe I was 26, in my 20s anyway. And there's a couple my age, and they wanted to talk to me. And, I talk to anybody. He said, well, we have an unplanned pregnancy, and we're trying to decide whether to abort or not. And I about fell over. I couldn't believe there's somebody standing in a church trying to decide whether to have an abortion or not. I couldn't believe there were people in Muskegon County who were pro-choice. I was shocked. It was an eye-opener. See, that's how I had to change. That's adiaphora. Whatever your view on that is, it does not pertain to salvation. And then I remember this thing about tobacco use. In my background growing up, everybody smoked. I mean, everybody. And I've heard the same was true around here in the early days of Laketon Bethel. We're about 75, 80 years old as a church. I heard this week that the furnace room in the old part of the building used to be a smoking room, and that people would go in there. And I've heard that some Sundays the cover of the furnace blower would come off, and all that smoke would get sucked into the sanctuary. And those were interesting Sundays. They apparently didn't happen very often, but it happened. And then later on, people would pile out of the old auditorium and stand there facing Giles Road and light their cigarettes up. And everybody did it. Well, my background's the same. My dad was a 2-pack-a-day Winston guy until he had his heart attack. I didn't think anything of it. Then I got to Oral Roberts University, where I got my bachelor's degree from. Tobacco use was terribly forbidden. No smoking. You could chew, but you couldn't smoke. But it's Oklahoma, even the women chew there. But it was so interesting how that worked. It was strictly forbidden, and that was new to me. I didn't think that smoking was a sin or that it was even inappropriate. Everybody I knew in Iowa smoked. Well, so in that smoke-free environment in Tulsa, I moved to Holland, Michigan in 1979. And I go to Western Seminary, and there's a reception for new students in the Commons. And I walk into that Commons, and there's this familiar blue cloud in the Commons. Professors are standing there smoking their pipes and their cigarettes and whatnot. And I took a deep breath. I said, it smells like home, minus the hog manure. But it was close. Well, I had a buddy whose wife was terribly offended and said that real Christians couldn't smoke. And so she was able to talk her husband into switching to a different seminary where, they only smoked when no one was watching. But I was so surprised to notice this. I was so surprised at the reaction. And of course, these days, same with marijuana use, same thing, you run into strong believers who use marijuana. Well, 30 years ago, that would have surprised me, but it doesn't today. And here's the big one. Democrats and Republicans. As adiaphora, it doesn't matter what your political party is, as long as you trust Jesus to save you. It's not a part of salvation. We have incredible political division. In my lifetime, we're as divided as we ever been. But here's the shocker, folks, whatever your affiliation is, there are people on the other side of the aisle who are firm believers in Jesus. And it doesn't matter what your political views are. And then there's fat or thin. It's a question, can gluttons be Christians? Hope so. The answer is, of course, yes, if you trust Jesus to save you. And then there's the biggie, gay or straight. The Reformed Church in America has lost 47% of its membership in the last year and a half over that question. Can we allow gay people to come in? Can gay people be saved? The answer is yes, just like straight people, if they trust Jesus to save them. What about felons? Well, or those who've never got caught committing their felonies. It's the same thing. Everyone is equal at the foot of the cross. God's grace is greater than anything we can do. So what this boils down to is, can we accept each other? Can we focus on what's important and let the rest go? Well, I hope so. Now, here's what I want you to take away today. I want you to take away a couple of things. One is I want you to know that everyone is saved the same way, by trusting Jesus to save you. It's the only way. And the second thing I hope to do is to get everybody to stop labeling people. I would like all of you to make it a point to take the words conservative and liberal out of your vocabulary, because they are meaningless words. They don't mean anything, and they're always untrue. So get rid of them. Take them out of your vocabulary. Don't use them anymore. When I was a kid, one of my friends had a cuss jar where he had to put a quarter in every time he said certain words. And I didn't know what those words were, so I asked his mother to tell me what those words were, and she told me, and then her son, my friend, said, "Mom, you need to put $2 in the jar now." And but I think we should have a conservative liberal jar. And anytime we use those words, put in not a quarter. Let's just say it'll go to the general fund of Laketon Bethel. So every time you use those words, you got to put $5,000 in that jar. All right, that'll eliminate our deficit. And if you put if it costs you $5,000 to call somebody a conservative or a liberal, you probably won't do it again. So I'm teasing about that, but we really need to stop labeling people. It doesn't do any good. Now, here's what I've learned, folks, is that your example, if you do this, will be powerful. You know, I have 5 adult children, and they are watching me. I think my influence over them is greater today than it ever has been. Because they look at what I do, they listen to what I say, they disagree with everything I say automatically, but they're watching, they're listening. Now I have grandchildren, same thing. They're listening, they're watching. We have incredible influence over them, especially if we give them gifts. We have all kinds of influence. You know, and I think about, we've got one of those little electronic picture things that comes on at 7 in the morning, and you can load pictures in it to rotate. I never knew one of my grandpas, or I can barely remember him. He died when I was 6 years old. But there's pictures of me and him in that thingamajigger. And every time I look at those, I think, now I wonder how much influence that guy's had on me. And I'm sure it's quite a bit. Because I'm sure I watched every move he made when I was 6 years old. The influence that you have on your kids and your grandkids never stops. And if you stop labeling people, it will have an impact on them. They're watching, and your grandkids are watching. So you can make good changes by not labeling anyone. As Paul said later in his letter to the Colossians, be gracious in your speech. The goal is to bring out the best in others in a conversation, not put them down, not cut them out. So that's what we do. To our video audience, I'm going to stop rolling the video now because we are going to go into the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, which you're welcome to join us, but I can't do that on video. So, as always, thanks for listening.